This case study takes place in a secondary school context where students with formal dyslexia identification are completing reading and writing intensive assignments in English, social studies, and science courses, while having access to AI tools as part of their accommodation and learning support routines. In this study, the AI supports participants used fell into 4 concrete categories: tools that simplified or summarized reading passages, tools that clarified or rephrased assignment prompts, tools that generated outlines or planning steps, and tools that suggested wording during drafting and revision. The phenomenon is that AI-based supports are increasingly being used by learners with dyslexia during reading and writing tasks to help them initiate and complete academic work. The tension is that supports designed to help can create an instability between assistance and autonomy, where learners may feel supported yet still constrained, or capable yet still dependent, because the support changes how independence is enacted and negotiated. The consequence is that if this instability remains unresolved, learners may internalize dependence or develop fragile competence, or alternatively develop self-efficacy, depending on how the support is structured and experienced over time. Educational settings have increasingly introduced AI-based supports to assist learners with dyslexia during reading and writing tasks. These tools can generate outlines, simplify text, suggest wording, and break complex assignments into manageable steps. In practice, educators often describe these supports as promoting independence because students can complete work with fewer interruptions and less direct adult assistance. Yet independence is not a single observable behavior. For many learners with dyslexia, independence involves confidence, initiation, self-trust, and the felt ability to begin and persist without relying on someone else to interpret the task. When schools implement AI tools primarily as performance supports, they may assume independence has increased simply because more work is completed. The unresolved tension is that task completion may rise while the lived experience of independence remains unclear or even conflicted. This tension matters because independence is tied to long-term academic identity and persistence. If AI tools foster a sense of agency, learners may begin to see themselves as capable initiators rather than students who need constant mediation. But if AI tools function as a substitute dependency, learners may experience short-term relief without developing internal ownership of learning. Without understanding how learners themselves experience independence in the presence of AI support, schools risk adopting tools based on surface indicators while overlooking the meaning-level consequences that shape motivation, self-efficacy, and willingness to attempt challenging work. The existing literature documents increasing technology use for accommodations and reports outcomes such as productivity, assignment completion, and perceived usefulness. However, much of this work treats independence as a measurable endpoint rather than an experience construct. Studies may show that students submit more work or require fewer teacher prompts, yet they often do not examine what independence means to learners with dyslexia or how students interpret the shift from adult-mediated support to tool-mediated support. As a result, the field lacks meaning-centered understanding of what independence is like from the inside for learners with dyslexia using AI tools during academic tasks. Together, this reveals a literature gap that is not primarily numerical. The field can observe surface indicators such as reduced prompts or increased completion, but it has not yet clarified the lived experiences of independence in this specific context, which means decisions are being made without understanding participant meaning. Because this missing knowledge is meaning-centered and grounded in lived experience, a qualitative methodology is required rather than a design that tests impact, influence, or effect. Because the qualitative gap centers on what it is like to experience independence with AI support from the inside, the appropriate qualitative design is phenomenology, which focuses on the essence of lived experience. A simple way to remember phenomenology is to picture a set of stained glass windows. Each student's interview is one window showing the same light from a slightly different angle. Phenomenology does not choose one window as the truth. It studies all the windows to identify the shared pattern in the glasswork and the shared colors that keep appearing. The final product is a description of the pattern itself, the consistent design that shows up across the different windows. That shared pattern is the essence of the lived experience. This study used an interpretive phenomenological stance to understand not only what students experienced, but how they made meaning of independence while using AI tools. This mattered because independence is not just a set of behaviors like starting faster or asking fewer questions. Independence is also the meaning students attach to those behaviors, including whether they feel ownership, agency, confidence, and responsibility while using support. To keep the analysis disciplined, the researchers still use bracketing practices, not to erase interpretation, but to prevent the researchers' assumptions about AI, productivity, and independence from overriding participant meaning. The goal was to let students' descriptions lead the meaning structure, and then interpret that structure carefully and transparently. This study focused on the lived experience of independence while using AI tools during academic tasks. It did not study general attitudes about AI unrelated to schoolwork. It did not evaluate academic performance outcomes, grades, or test scores. It did not attempt to determine whether AI tools caused independence. Instead, it examined what independence was like from the inside for learners who were using these tools in real academic routines. The researcher approached this study as an adult educator and researcher who values learner agency and has professional exposure to dyslexia supports and classroom accommodations. Because this background can create expectations that certain tools should increase independence, the researcher treated positionality as a potential influence on interpretation. Reflexive memos were used throughout the study to document assumptions, monitor moments of bias risk, and keep participant meaning central, especially when participant descriptions challenged common assumptions about productivity and independence. In this study, independence was treated as a lived construct with observable and internal components. Observable components included initiation of tasks without waiting for an adult to translate directions, sustained engagement without repeated external prompting, and decision-making about how to use supports. Internal components included perceived agency, felt ownership of the work, confidence to begin, and self-trust that the student could navigate difficulty without losing control of the task. This definition mattered because it clarified what counted as evidence in the data. A student finishing an assignment faster could count as independence only if the student also described experiences of agency or self-directed engagement, rather than describing that the tool simply replaced their thinking or voice. Based on this reasoning, the purpose of this phenomenological study was to explore the lived experiences of independence among learners with dyslexia when using AI tools during academic tasks. Guided by this purpose, the study addressed the following research question. What are the lived experiences of independence among learners with dyslexia when using AI tools during academic tasks? Participants were recruited through a school-based learning support office that served students with documented dyslexia. Recruitment materials were distributed to families through the support office, and interested families contacted the research team to learn more. Eligibility was verified through school documentation indicating dyslexia identification, and through confirmation that the student had used at least one AI support tool category for academic tasks over at least one academic term. This ensured that participants were able to describe repeated lived experiences, rather than only novelty reactions. The sample consisted of 12 secondary learners formally identified with dyslexia who had used AI tools for at least one academic term in reading and writing-intensive coursework. Participants were selected to ensure that each student could describe repeated experiences of using AI support across multiple assignments rather than offering only first impressions. This study did not aim for a large sample because the goal was depth, not representativeness. 12 participants was judged sufficient because the interviews and logs produced rich, detailed descriptions, and the same meaning structures began to recur across students. In plain language, after multiple interviews, New participants were not introducing completely new kinds of experiences, but were adding detail and nuance to the same core patterns of initiation: emotional risk, ownership, and confidence. That recurrence signaled that the study had enough depth to describe the essence of the phenomenon for this context. The study unfolded across a short cycle designed to capture both reflection and in-the-moment experience. First, recruitment and consent occurred. Second, each student completed an initial interview. Third, each student completed reflection logs after 2 separate assignments. Fourth, a brief follow-up contact occurred if clarification was needed based on log entries. Finally, member reflection occurred after preliminary themes were written, so students could confirm whether the themes reflected their experience. Because the participants were minors and were identified with a learning disability, the study used layered consent and privacy protections. Parent or guardian consent and student assent were obtained before participation. Students were told participation was voluntary, that they could skip any question, and that stopping participation would not affect grades, services, or relationships with teachers. Interviews were scheduled in private spaces to reduce peer exposure. Pseudonyms were assigned, identifying details were removed from transcripts, and recordings and documents were stored securely with access limited to the research team. These protections were designed to reduce risk, while supporting honest description of lived experience. Data were collected primarily through in-depth, semi-structured interviews designed to elicit concrete descriptions of lived moments. Rather than asking students to evaluate AI tools in general, interview prompts asked students to describe specific experiences, such as a time they started an assignment with AI support, a time they tried without it, a moment they felt capable, and a moment they felt stuck even with support. Follow-up prompts pressed for sensory and emotional detail: what the student noticed, what changed internally, and what they believed the experience meant about their own capability. To deepen contextual grounding, participants also completed brief reflection logs after 2 assignments. In these logs, students described how they initiated the task, when they relied on the tool, what tool category they used, and how independent they felt during the process. To elicit lived experience rather than opinions, the interview guide used "tell me about a specific time" prompts, and then drilled down with concrete probes. Example core questions included: describe a specific time you used an AI tool to start an assignment. What happened from the moment you saw the prompt to the moment you began working? Describe a specific time you tried to start without the AI tool. What was different in your body, your thoughts, and your emotions? Describe a moment when you felt independent while using the tool. What made it feel like independence? Describe a moment when the tool helped you finish work, but you did not feel independent. What made it not feel like independence? Tell me about a time you worried the work did not sound like you. What did you do next? Example probes included: what did you do first, second, third? What did you notice in that moment? What were you telling yourself? What did you expect would happen if you asked a teacher instead? When you say it felt easier, what exactly became easier? How did you decide whether to accept or reject what the tool suggested? How did you feel when you turned it in? Before data collection, the researcher recorded assumptions commonly attached to AI tools, including the belief that fewer teacher prompts indicates greater independence. Throughout the study, reflexive memos were used to monitor how these assumptions might shape questioning, interpretation, or theme development. This practice supported analytic discipline by keeping participant meaning central, rather than treating researcher expectations as conclusions. To manage the data systematically, each participant was assigned a case file containing the transcript, reflection logs, and researcher memos. Transcripts and logs were stored in a secure folder, and each document was labeled using a consistent naming convention so materials could be traced through analysis. Coding was conducted by annotating transcripts and logs with codes, then transferring codes into a structured table organized by participant, data source, and code. This organization made it possible to compare patterns across participants, track where themes were supported by both interviews and logs, and maintain an audit trail showing how themes were derived. All interviews were audio recorded, transcribed verbatim, and checked for accuracy against the recordings. Reflection logs were exported and formatted so that each participant's interview transcript and logs could be reviewed together as a single case record, preserving the sequence of lived moments described across data sources. The researcher read each case record in full multiple times before assigning any codes. During these reads, the researcher wrote margin notes capturing initial impressions in descriptive language rather than interpretation, using phrases such as started quickly, waited for clarity, felt exposed, relied on tool, revised to sound like me. This step ensured that early analytic attention stayed close to participant wording and concrete experience. Significant statements were defined as statements that met all three criteria. The statement described a concrete moment or episode, not just a general opinion. The statement included a description of experience such as actions, feelings, thoughts, or internal dialogue related to independence. The statement was connected to AI tool use during an academic task, meaning it revealed how independence was experienced in that context. This meant that not every interesting quote was treated as significant. For example, a statement like AI is helpful, and I like it was not selected because it was general and evaluative. A statement like when I opened the assignment, I felt my stomach drop, so I asked the tool to break it into steps, and then I could finally start without waiting for my teacher was selected because it described a lived moment, included embodied and emotional detail, and tied that experience directly to how independence was experienced through tool use. Each significant statement was assigned a short, plain language code that captured what the student was experiencing, using participant-near phrasing whenever possible. Examples included can start without waiting, private help feels safer, tool changes my voice, I still choose, I don't feel stuck, I rely too fast, I feel in control. After the first cycle, codes were reviewed and grouped into meaning units, which are clusters of codes that express the same core idea in different participant language. This step reduced fragmentation and clarified the structure of the experience. For example, codes such as can start without waiting, I begin faster, and I don't need directions explained were grouped into a meaning unit labeled initiation without waiting. Codes such as private help feels safer, I avoid asking in class, and I don't feel embarrassed were grouped into a meaning unit labeled reduced exposure. Raw significant statement. I used the tool to make a plan because I couldn't figure out where to start. Once it gave me steps, I felt like I could do it. But when it wrote sentences for me, I didn't feel proud, and I worried it wasn't really mine. First cycle codes. Needs help to start steps create confidence tool writes for me loss of pride not mine. Second cycle meaning units. Initiation without waiting. Confidence through scaffolding. Ownership threatened by substitution. These meaning units contributed to themes that described independence as initiation and independence as ownership versus outsourcing. A working codebook was built that defined each meaning unit, listed inclusion and exclusion rules, and provided example excerpts for each meaning unit. As additional transcripts were coded, the codebook was revised to reduce overlap between meaning units and to clarify boundaries. For instance, the researcher distinguished between reliance as strategy, where learners used AI tools intentionally to scaffold thinking, and reliance as substitution, where learners described AI as doing the work in a way that weakened ownership. Reflection logs were first coded using the same first cycle codes used for interviews, focusing on moments of initiation, tool choice, reliance, confidence, and ownership. Then, log excerpts were linked to the corresponding interview themes for each participant to confirm whether the themes reflected both retrospective interview description and in-the-moment task reflections. When logs showed a pattern that was not strongly present in interviews, the researcher returned to transcripts to look for overlooked significant statements and to check whether a meaning unit needed to be expanded. This integration strengthened the phenomenological description by connecting lived accounts across time and data sources, rather than relying on interviews alone. Meaning units were then compared across all participants to identify patterns that repeated across multiple cases. Meaning units that reflected the same larger structure of experience were clustered into themes. For example, initiation without waiting and reduced exposure clustered into a broader theme describing how independence was experienced as controlled access to support. Ownership threatened by substitution and confidence through scaffolding clustered into a broader theme describing independence as a negotiation between agency and reliance. For each theme, the researcher wrote a textual description explaining what participants experienced using concrete detail drawn from statements and logs. Then the researcher wrote a structural description explaining how the experience happened, focusing on conditions that shaped the experience, such as assignment type, prior history of needing adult mediation, classroom norms for asking for help, tool familiarity, and the specific ways AI tools were used. The final analytic step integrated the textual and structural descriptions into a composite description that represented the shared essence of the phenomenon across participants while acknowledging important variations. In this study, the essence centered on independence experienced as self-initiated engagement supported by tool-mediated scaffolding, shaped by continual negotiation between agency and reliance. Not every participant experienced independence the same way, and the analysis treated mismatches as evidence that could refine themes rather than as noise. When a participant described an experience that did not fit an emerging theme, the researcher marked it as a negative case and returned to the data to ask what condition might explain the difference. For example, when a student described that AI made them feel less independent because they began relying immediately rather than attempting first steps, that case was used to sharpen the boundary between scaffolding and substitution. These negative cases were discussed in memos and used to revise theme language, so themes reflected the range of experiences while still describing the shared essence. To strengthen analytic consistency, the researcher used 3 procedures. First, a second reader reviewed a subset of transcripts using the codebook and flagged places where codes seemed unclear or overlapping. Second, the researcher and second reader held a code check meeting to compare coding decisions, revise code definitions, and clarify inclusion and exclusion rules. Third, the researcher recoded earlier transcripts using the revised codebook to ensure the updated definitions were applied consistently across the full dataset. Credibility was supported through member reflection, in which participants reviewed short thematic summaries and clarified whether the themes matched their experience. Dependability was strengthened through an audit trail documenting coding decisions, codebook changes, and theme revisions. Confirmability was supported through reflexive memos that made interpretive choices visible and traceable. Transferability was addressed through thick description of participant context, including academic settings, typical task demands, and the kinds of AI supports used, allowing readers to judge similarity to other contexts. After preliminary themes were developed, each participant received a short, plain language summary of the themes and a brief description of what each theme meant. Participants were asked 3 specific questions. Does this sound like your experience? What feels accurate, and what feels off? Is anything missing that you think matters? Participants could respond by writing notes, recording a short response, or answering in a brief follow-up conversation. Their feedback was used in 2 ways. Language revisions, where theme names and descriptions were adjusted to match participant phrasing more closely, and boundary revisions, where the researcher clarified when a theme applied and when it did not, especially around the difference between scaffolding and substitution. If nothing changes, schools may continue adopting AI supports using surface indicators of productivity as proof of independence, while misreading the lived reality of autonomy, ownership, and self-efficacy for learners with dyslexia, leading to supports that are misaligned with what learners actually experience and need. If this lived experience is understood more precisely, beneficiaries include educators, instructional leaders, disability support teams, and district decision-makers who must determine how to structure accommodations, what guardrails to set for AI use, and how to teach students to use tools in ways that build agency rather than replace it. This study contributes meaning-centered knowledge the literature has not yet clarified by making visible how independence is experienced and interpreted from the learner's perspective, which can inform decisions that currently rely on incomplete understanding of what independence actually becomes under AI-supported work. Independence as initiation without waiting means learners experience independence as the ability to begin work on their own timeline, because the tool helps them translate prompts into actionable first steps. Independence as reduced exposure and emotional risk means learners experience independence as being able to access help privately in ways that reduce embarrassment and social vulnerability. Independence as ownership versus outsourcing means learners experience independence as strengthened when the tool scaffolds decision-making, but weakened when the tool substitutes for thinking or voice, reducing authorship. Independence as fluctuating confidence across task types means learners experience independence as strong in some task stages, especially early planning and clarification, but fragile in other stages such as synthesis and voice. Findings revealed that independence was not experienced as a simple increase or decrease. Instead, participants described independence as a shifting structure shaped by how the tool interacted with initiation, ownership, and self-trust. Many participants described a before and after contrast in which independence meant being able to start. Prior to AI tool use, students often described sitting in hesitation, waiting for a teacher or parent to translate the assignment into steps. With AI tools, students described a change in their ability to initiate. They could ask the tool to break the task down, generate a starting structure, or clarify directions. One student described, "When I see the assignment, I freeze, but if it turns it into steps, I can pick the first one and start." The lived experience of independence here was not finishing alone. It was beginning on their own timeline rather than waiting for adult mediation. Participants frequently connected independence to the emotional safety of working without public struggle. Several described that asking a tool for help felt less exposing than asking a teacher to re-explain directions. One student explained, "If I ask again, everyone knows I didn't get it, but the tool doesn't look at me like that." In this sense, independence was experienced as protection from embarrassment, and as control over when and how support was accessed. However, this theme also revealed an internal tension. Some students felt independent because they did not have to ask a person, yet they also felt uneasy because the tool became the first place they turned whenever difficulty appeared. Participants distinguished between using AI tools to scaffold their thinking and using AI tools to replace their thinking. When students used AI to clarify instructions, generate options, or organize ideas, they often described feeling more agentic because they still chose, revised, and directed the work. One student said, "It gives me choices, but I decide what to keep so it still feels like mine." But when students used AI to generate large portions of text, they described a weakening of ownership. Another student shared, "It sounded too perfect, and I didn't feel like I did it." This created a paradox. They could complete the assignment with less struggle, but they did not always feel more independent. In these accounts, independence was tied to authorship and identity, not merely completion. Participants described that AI tools supported independence most strongly during early-stage tasks such as planning, outlining, and interpreting prompts. Yet for tasks requiring sustained comprehension, synthesizing multiple sources, or writing in a personal voice, some students described that independence remained fragile. One student noted, "It helps me start, but when I have to put it all together, I still get lost." The tool could reduce friction, but it did not automatically produce durable confidence. Independence was experienced as situational and uneven, increasing in some moments while remaining unstable in others. In phenomenology, themes are not separate findings that stand alone. Themes function like the core components of a shared meaning structure. Each theme captures one major way the phenomenon was experienced across participants, and together the themes interlock to form the composite description. When the analysis moves from meaning units to themes, it is building the architecture of the experience piece by piece. When the analysis moves from themes to the essence, it is synthesizing that architecture into one integrated statement that describes what independence was like from the inside, across learners. In other words, the essence is not a new idea added at the end. The essence is the themes woven together into a single, unified description of the lived experience. Across these themes, the essence of the phenomenon emerged as independence experienced as self-initiated engagement supported by tool-mediated scaffolding, shaped by a constant negotiation between agency and reliance. Participants did not describe independence as the absence of support. They described it as control over support, the ability to begin, and the sense that the work still belonged to them. This study was limited by context and scope. The sample included a small number of secondary learners in specific course contexts, so the findings describe the essence of this experience for these participants rather than claiming the same structure for all learners with dyslexia. Tool access and classroom norms varied across participants, meaning some experiences of independence were shaped by differences in what tools were allowed, how teachers framed tool use, and whether students felt safe using supports. Because interviews rely on recall and self-report, some descriptions may emphasize memorable moments more than routine ones. Finally, the study focused on student experience and meaning, which strengthens understanding of the phenomenon, but does not test causal impact of AI tools on measurable outcomes. For initiation without waiting, educators can explicitly teach students a start routine that uses AI for task clarification and step creation, then requires the student to choose the first action and restate it in their own words before continuing. For reduced exposure and emotional risk, teachers can create private help pathways that normalize support seeking, such as quiet check-ins, written question options, or structured tool use guidelines, so independence does not become synonymous with hiding struggle. For ownership versus outsourcing, schools can set clear authorship guardrails. Students can use AI to generate options, outlines, or explanations, but must produce a personal voice pass where they revise, annotate, or explain choices, making ownership visible and strengthening agency. For fluctuating confidence across task types, support plans can be differentiated by task stage. AI can be emphasized for early-stage planning and comprehension supports, while separate instruction targets synthesis, voice, and self-monitoring so confidence becomes more durable rather than situational. In plain language, the lived experiences of independence among learners with dyslexia using AI tools were experienced as being able to start work without waiting, being able to access help privately without embarrassment, and still feeling agency and ownership when the tool scaffolded rather than replaced their thinking, while confidence remained uneven across different types of tasks. As AI tools become common supports for learners with dyslexia, the tension between help and autonomy carries real consequences for agency and identity, and the essence of this case is that independence is lived as self-initiated engagement enabled by tool-mediated scaffolding while constantly being negotiated against the risk of outsourcing ownership.